So why Ecuador exactly? It's a country that includes the Galapagos Islands as part of its territory, and it's given asylum to the Wikileaks founder Julian Assange. But how much do we know about the human rights record of the country itself? Is it a champion of free speech, or does it have its own agenda? Well, Jonathan Farmer is the editor of Latin American newsletters, which provides expert analysis on countries like Ecuador. Guadalupe Marengo is the deputy director of the Americas programme at Amnesty International, and I think Amnesty published a report last month. What did you find?
Yes, on Ecuador we found plenty of human rights violations, like in most of the countries in the world, unfortunately. So if you want me to focus on Ecuador in particular, mainly our concerns there are criminalization of protest. The leaders, indigenous leaders and human rights defenders and campesino leaders are criminalized because they protest. We also found cases of violation of freedom of expression too. Those are our main concerns.
So freedom of expression via the press or media? What do you mean?
Via the media, yes. Three journalists, one journalist and the owners of three owners of a newspaper, El Universo, were charged and sentenced for 3 years and given a fine of $40 for having called President Rafael Correa a dictator. He then actually pardoned them, but the chilling effect that sent, to the rest of, people wanting to criticize or publish things against the government is sort of huge.
Jonathan, I'm sure some people would join the dots there and say, well, how ironic then that, these people are heading, Edward Snowden is heading apparently to Ecuador, a place where you can't protest and, you might get arrested for doing so.
Well, absolutely. I mean, Ecuador accuses the US of double standards on human rights, on democracy. It's quite happy to sort of buttress useful dictators around the world, Ecuador would argue. But then Ecuador practices double standards on the media because, on the one hand, it grants diplomatic asylum to Julian Assange because it claims he had freedom of expression, and back at home there's a very strong argument that it's muzzling the domestic media. Only last week, sorry, a tiny bit more on that, the Friday before, they passed a media law which includes some fairly draconian ideas, particularly the idea of lynching by media, which is a concept I think unique to Ecuador, whereby if a journalist was found to have repeatedly defamed somebody, they could face very serious fines and potential imprisonment. So this is very much cowing the press back in Ecuador, and I think you could argue it's a huge domestic political issue at the moment. Rafael Correa describes journalists as contract killers with ink, using ink, and also the #1 enemy in the state. He sees them very much as a political actor.
Yes, one wonders, I mean, I suppose let's put the question the other way round. Had someone who worked for the security authorities in Ecuador decided to take it upon himself to leak a huge sum of information about the private goings-on of the Ecuadorian state, one would imagine that the president would take a pretty dim view of it.
I think, yes, one would imagine that, but then it isn't surprising, that's what, governments usually do. They are hypocrites when it comes to human rights.
Well, this would be illegal. I mean, he would face the same charges in Ecuador that he would face in the US. And Rafael Correa, who's like sort of his big issue is national sovereignty, and he's always talking about the intervention of states.
So why is Ecuador taking the stance that it's taking? I mean, is it an anti-Yankeeism that you saw in the kind of, in Latin America a lot during the 1970s and 80s, or is it something different?
There's a big element of that. There's a visceral anti-Americanism in Ecuador. I think some people would argue this is the sort of opportunity for Correa to become the heir to Hugo Chavez, who obviously recently died, as the sort of leader of the progressive left in Latin America. Others would argue it just gives Ecuador greater prominence, and it could be seen as a sort of champion of developing countries.
I mean, you always kind of had a feeling that before this, and I sort of mentioned it in my intro, that Ecuador was most famous for being, custodian of the Galapagos Islands, and it now seems to be becoming a custodian of sort of, people who have tweaked the tail of the United States of America.
Well, President Correa, he does cock a snook at the US with fairly frequently. I mean, only last year he had Iran's President Mohammad Ahmadinejad on the presidential balcony in Quito, and he was talking about importing uranium from Iran. It was all a big joke, but he was very clearly enjoying the opportunity just to, like you say, to sort of tweak the US.
Go on.
Yes, could I just add here, I do think it is important now with the information we have at the moment that from an Amnesty International's perspective, you know, Snowden hasn't necessarily committed a crime. What he's done at the moment with the information we have is sort of put forward information of a possible human rights violation of his government, and nobody should be persecuted for that.
Right.
So he has got sort of a, first of all, everybody has got the right to ask for political asylum, and the Ecuadorian state, like any other state, having signed the convention, you know, on refugees, has to, you know, ascertain whether he's being persecuted or not, and then give him asylum.
Okay, Guadalupe, Jonathan, both of you, thank you very much indeed